We now move on to our keynote. I'm obviously absolutely delighted to have Branko Milanovic here with us today, one of the world's leading experts on globalization and inequality. I presume that just about everybody in the room has read Global Inequality, A New Approach in the Age of Globalization. If you haven't, then I suggest you very much do so. But we're not here today to talk about that book. We're here to talk about Branko's new book, Capitalism Alone, in which he argues that capitalism is basically here to stay because it's better at generating prosperity and providing for individual autonomy than other systems. But it's far from perfect, and throughout the book, Branko sounds like quite a grudging fan of capitalism. He pulls no punches, listing the problems that we see both in advanced capitalist economies in Europe and the US, but also in more sort of what he terms politically capitalist societies such as China. For the purposes of this discussion, we'd actually rather focus on the problems that we have in our own economies. I'm hoping that you will talk us through a little bit about what needs to happen most urgently and how we can bring those changes about.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody actually for having stayed here until this late hour. I know that it is late. I would stay within my allotment of 15 minutes. You would tell me when I'm down to 2 minutes left. I brought a copy of the book. It does exist. It's called Capitalism Alone. There is a reason why it is called Capitalism Alone. I will not go into that, but it's not an accidental title. And it will be published in German in June. So I'm sure I would be back here in June. Now, I was actually asked, obviously, to talk very briefly and to talk about what I call liberal or meritocratic capitalism. The book, of course, deals with liberal/meritocratic capitalism and then deals with political capitalism of China. So in the first part, it is really, I look and I study and I take examples mostly from the US and obviously advanced countries. In the second part, I deal with China. So obviously, I will not talk about the second part. Now, the structure of my talk today also is going to be obviously sort of fit for the 15-minute presentation. I will sort of walk you through what I believe are 6 systemic forces that push inequality in liberal capitalism up. And then I would say why I think that requires a change in the vision of redistribution. So that I would sort of argue, and I will try to explain why the vision of the 20th century welfare state, which essentially redistributes the created income, current income, is insufficient to deal with systemic changes that push inequality up. Now, let me go very quickly over them because some of them actually are quite well known by many people here, and some of them actually, Tim already mentioned that in the case of Germany, the rising share of capital in total income. Now, this is something that has been established very clearly in the number of cases going back to the 1980s. Now, the question you ask, now, why is this a problem? From the interpersonal income inequality, it is a problem because people who receive most of their income from ownership, from capital, tend to be rich people. You know, it would not be a problem of interpersonal income inequality if a high concentration of capital was such that poor people receive capital income. Now, it seems to us inconceivable because through history, it is always the rich people who are receiving capital incomes. But what I want to say is that this is a particular constellation where one source, which is very heavily concentrated, and it's very heavily concentrated amongst the rich, is rising. So that's actually the driving factor behind part of inequality. I will come to the other types. So this is the problem because the distribution, as I said, of income from capital, which is now here in blue, and you see several countries there, and over time, is extremely unequal. So you have the Gini coefficient of capital income, which is in the range of 0.85 to 0.95. It can hardly go higher than that. And that's why you don't see that much of a change there, because you cannot go to a Gini coefficient of 1, I mean, where the entire capital income from a country is received by one family. You might come close to that. Actually, I recently had a discussion regarding Chile and Brazil, where actually you do relatively come close to that, because the concentration is so excessive that you have a Gini coefficient which goes over 95. But obviously, compared to labor, which is of course also becoming more unequally distributed, as you notice here in the case of the UK in particular, you see a very significant increase. You still have the blue line, the capital line, being always above the red line. And that was, of course, the reason why increasing share of capital in total income would, what I call, quasi-automatically translate into higher interpersonal inequality. This is based on Luxembourg income study microdata. The same thing can be displayed differently here. I looked at a greater number of countries. As you notice, most advanced countries are clustered around that very high inequality of capital income. There are some exceptions. I will not speak about them, but for example, Taiwan is interesting because it has lower concentration of capital income. There are historical reasons for that, but you notice that it is not dramatically lower, but it is lower than Western advanced economies. Then the second feature which pushes inequality up, that was also mentioned before when actually Tim talked about the distribution of wealth in Germany. The problem there is that sometimes, and it's not very well documented, I have to say, but sometimes the rich people seems to have higher returns per unit of their assets than other less rich people or middle class. That stems from two possibilities. One, this is actually based from work that Ed Wolf did, but I could have actually used, and there was a very nice graph that Schulerick has in his paper about wealth inequality in the US over 50 years. It is that essentially the distribution is such that the top 5%, or basically top 5%, has most of their wealth in financial assets. Those who still have wealth, which is really the middle class people going from the 50th percentile to the 95th percentile, have most of their assets in housing. Under the conditions where financial assets outperform housing, then the composition by itself gives an advantage to the rich. So the return to the rich is higher. What is also interesting is that in some cases, it seems, that not only the composition is favoring the rich, it is also that within a given asset class, the rich might have higher returns. Simply, the question is the following. If I have 1 million and you have $1,000 and we both invest, am I going to have a higher return simply because I had $1 million and you will have a lower return than I, simply because the amount of money that you had was less? Now, there are many reasons that actually people believe that will be the case, including asymmetric information, barriers to entry, and others. And I think this is an area which is still worthwhile studying, but I think it's quite possible that it's the case. Now, if that is the case, that's a further advantage which would actually exacerbate the rising share of capital that is received by the rich, because on top of the rising share, they would also have higher returns. Now, the next one is actually something that I introduced in the book, for which I had to invent the name. So you have to coin a name. Now, when you coin a new term, obviously, where do you go back? You go back to Greek. And I coined a term, which I checked with a number of Greek friends. It's called homoploutia. Homoploutia means literally same wealth, but actually means that the same people, more and more, you see that on the slide, are both capital rich and labor rich. So that means that an increasing percentage of people in advanced rich economies tend to be both in the top decile by their capital income and by labor income. Now, that per se is not a bad development, because of course in the book I deal with that, going back and looking at what you can call Ricardo Marx capitalism. You had on one side capitalists, they were all rich and they had only income from capital. But then on the other side you had labor, they were all poorer and they didn't have capital income. So we are now much better because we do have many people, significant number of people, who actually now at the top have both types of income. But the problem is that being on the top and combining these two sources of income makes it sometimes more difficult, or maybe ethically more difficult, to go after them, because they are actually having large part of their income from labor. And also we know empirically that many of these people who have high income from labor also work very hard, actually work longer hours than people with lower income. So that also can be done across countries. I'm using this data, Luxembourg income study data. And you notice here that basically the countries range from 15% to 15% of people who are in the top decile by labor being in the top decile by capital income, and up to 30%. But countries like, for me, they're interesting, like Brazil and Mexico, are still in the earlier stages of capitalism, where basically the capital-rich people don't work. And that's why you have lower numbers. So I use this example simply to show the difference between more advanced, or what I call liberal meritocratic capitalist countries, from less advanced countries that are more of the Ricardo/Marx type of capitalism, where rich capitalists would not generally double as wage workers. The next fourth factor is, that was again Greek word, but it was not coined by me. It was assortative mating or homogamy. That has received recently quite a lot of attention. This is based on a slightly different data. And what this shows is that if you take a cohort of young American males, people between 20 and 35 years of age, in 1970, the fact that the two lines, red and blue, coincide means that they were equally likely to marry a woman. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that they are young American males, 20 to 35 years of age, who are in the top decile by earnings, by salaries. They were as equally likely to marry women who are in the top decile, let's call them rich women, as women who are in the bottom decile by salaries. Now, what you notice here, really a bifurcation. Nowadays, a new cohort of people of the same age as the 1970s, but new cohort obviously, are 3 times as likely to marry rich women as to marry poor women. And so that actually I do have a gender impact, differential here. I did the same thing for women. Now for women, the gap and the change is even more dramatic. You start with 1-to-1 ratio as for men, but now you end up with 5-to-1 ratio. That means when you put it with homoploutia, that means that we are having greater percentage of people, first, who are of the same education level, similar education level, similar income level, marrying each other, and also having then very high labor and capital incomes, and in a part which I will not discuss now, but that also leads to obviously large investments that they can make in terms of connection, time, and financial investments into their kids, and into making sure that the kids go to schools and do everything else which requires for them to have high incomes in the future. So you really have there a sketch, and as I said, I will not talk about that today, a sketch of a creation of a self-sustaining upper elite or upper class, which is to some extent being driven by preferences of mating and by ability of people to acquire both financial assets and, of course, to be very highly paid for their labor. The final point in tying that knot, I'll have 2 more minutes. In time, that was actually 2 minutes for the recommendations what should be done. So that would be very, very brief.
You can have more, but if you ask me to...
No, I know. So the last point in tying the knot is actually from a book by Martin Gilens, is the control of the political process by the rich. This graph simply shows, it's not simply because Johan has to explain what it is, it's not obviously clear, but what it does show is that the issues about which the rich care are much more likely to be debated and voted on in the US Congress. The same study I've seen actually done for Germany, the same results, and for what are the issues that care for the middle class cares really have no bearing on the likelihood of whether they would be voted at all or not. So this is the tying the knot, because that means that basically then the wealthy are also able to control the political process and to make the regulation that would actually keep them economically in power. So let me then say what should we do in terms of policy? What I believe. What I said before is that actually that I believe that the typical tools of the 20th century, which I call 4 tools, I believe, that actually led to the rise of the welfare state. Large role of the trade unions, increased in the number of years of education, high taxation, and high social transfers. I think that all 4 of them, and you can also guess for what reasons, but I think they have actually reached the limit of what they do in the future. In other words, it is like when you're cooking a dish and each of them has been sort of put on a very high, you just simply cannot do it anymore. In terms of high taxation of the middle class, maybe of ability to actually generate sufficiently a large chunk of the current income to transfer it. And in the case of trade unions, I think because the nature of a job has really radically changed with globalization. So then the question is, what should we do? And I think there is a need for a new vision, which I called in the book People's Capitalism. Now, people's capitalism, from what you have seen already, what I said, simply has to mean larger ownership, more broader ownership of capital. Because as I said before, if capital were very evenly distributed, or simply if it were not so unequally distributed as now, you would not have this automatic transmission from higher inequality in higher capital share into the interpersonal inequality. So then what are the sort of recommendations? I will just go very quickly over capital and labor. For capital, it is to focus on pre-redistribution, which I said before requires that we aim for the reduction of inequality or concentration of capital ownership or income from capital, or if you want to put it differently, less inequality in wealth. How can that be achieved? I'm very sort of brief on that in the book and here, because different countries have different mechanisms, but you can imagine that could be through workers' shares, that would be through measures that have been mentioned, for example, by Labour Party recently in the UK, employee stock ownership plans as they existed in the US, significant incentives for small investors, and even an insurance guarantee agency that would make sure that actually they will not lose all their small investments, and through inheritance taxation. So all of these measures, I think, should have a longer-term goal. They are not measures that would be realized, in 1 year or 2. The longer-term goal would be to reduce inequality in the distribution of capital assets and to reduce it quite significantly. When it comes to labor, the objective cannot be anymore increasing simply the quantity, the number of years of education, because many advanced countries have actually reached 14 or even 15 years of education on average. The objective should be making access equal to everybody to the schools and the types of education that lead to very high salaries and high incomes. In that sense, the US system, of course, is really an extreme case where essentially you have monopolization of the top educational jobs for those who are able to pay exorbitant tuition fees. And I should just mention that it was not by accident. I come originally from a country where you actually pay professors in order to pass your exam. But in the US, nobody pays professors to pass their exam because that's not an issue. And so that's why you have in the US a scandal of paying people to get your children into the top schools. Because once your children are in top schools, like, for example, George W. Bush, there is no question that you're going to graduate. So the question is not that he graduated from Yale. The question is he got admitted to Yale. And that's why the bribery is at the stage of admission. The bribery is not at the stage of professors. And that was actually, as I said, one of the ways in which intergenerational inequality is being transmitted. So my last slide. What should we then do with all these 6 different sort of tools that forces that increase inequality. How can we curb that increase? For the increasing share of capital in national income, I really do not see that we can do very much, but maybe we can do a little bit with stronger unions, demonopolization, and changing basically the structure of introducing more competition. High concentration of capital ownership, I've already spoken, so I will not say anything else about that. Higher rate of return to the assets of the rich, obviously higher taxation would work in that case, and higher taxation of capital gains and obviously income from capital in general. For homoploutia and homogamy, we cannot do anything unless you want to go to a Plato-like society where somebody, or maybe arranged marriages, which are actually a way to, in some cases, to reduce homogamy, but we obviously don't want to do that. So I don't think we can do very much in that area. And finally, for the control of the political process by the rich, I mean, this is very obvious, and I think it's such an important change, is really the electoral reform and the change in the financing of political parties. Now, let me finish also here with a sort of an anecdote, because very often people say in Europe, well, this is really a specifically American problem, because obviously you have, actually there are data on that, the concentration of contributions to political campaign has really a Gini of 99 or something, because if you go, you actually see that the 70% of contributions are made by 1/10 of 1% of people. So it's an extremely high concentration. But, in Europe too, if you look in the past, including Germany with Kohl, with Sarkozy, in France, and then Chirac, and then Berlusconi, and so on, all of these scandals were basically linked to financing of political parties. So I believe this is an important part of the agenda, would be really to actually change the system so that that link between wealth and ability to control political process be broken. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I went too far, but I couldn't do it. Thank you.